He led her methodically toward the edge, knowing that in the end, she would sign any document. But when he pushed her to the brink, she didn't fall. Instead, for the first time, she looked him straight in the eye.
Elena walked into the Internal Revenue Service building 15 minutes before her scheduled appointment. The metal detector beeped at someone ahead, a woman digging through her purse, pulling out a jangling set of keys. The security guard looked past her, waving people through one after another. Elena passed without delay. The lobby greeted her with the smell of cleaning solution and old paper. Cold rose from the floor, seeping through the soles of her shoes. Elena adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and gripped the folder of documents with both hands. The weight became more noticeable. Before, the folder had felt light, familiar. Today, it pressed down as if it had filled with something heavy. Elena repeated silently to herself, "Just to clarify." The letter from the IRS contained no direct threats. The wording had been neutral. Elena clung to that as proof that everything was still under control. The corridor turned out to be longer than she'd expected. Beige walls faded and peeling in places. Fluorescent lights flickered with a faint hum, casting uneven illumination. Plastic chairs lined the walls, most occupied by people clutching folders, phones, exhausted faces. No one spoke. Each person sank into their own private waiting. Elena took an empty chair near the window. The plastic was cold, the backrest rigid. She set the folder on her lap and opened it, flipping through pages mechanically. Familiar forms, familiar signatures. Her name repeated on every document. Neat letters, steady handwriting. Elena didn't read the words. She looked but didn't see the content, because these papers had never required her attention before. An electronic display board on the wall clicked, changing numbers. The sound was mechanical, indifferent. Elena watched the digits, comparing them to the number on her ticket. 4 more before her. She put her phone back in her bag, opened the folder again, closed it. Her hands searched for something to do, but found nothing. Tension gathered between her shoulder blades, slowly spreading up her neck. Elena caught herself scanning the corridor for Marcus. A habit. A reflex built over years. In difficult situations, she'd always turned around to check if he was nearby. Now the corridor was full of strangers. Marcus wasn't there, and recognizing this sent a spike of anxiety through her, brief but sharp. The board clicked again. Elena's number lit up in red. She flinched, though she'd been expecting it. She stood too quickly. The folder slipped and fell to the floor. Elena picked it up, pressed it to her chest, and walked down the corridor. The doors were identical, without nameplates, only numbers. The impersonality intensified the feeling that here, people didn't matter. Only processes did. The door she needed was at the far end of the corridor. Elena stopped in front of it, placed her hand on the handle, but didn't press down immediately. 1 second. 2. An attempt to delay the moment when she'd have to enter. Her breathing quickened, and Elena forced herself to exhale slowly, evenly. She knocked. Entered. The office looked sterile. Light-colored walls, a computer on the desk, stacks of folders neatly arranged on the right. A clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. The man behind the desk didn't look up right away. He was studying documents, turning pages methodically as if checking every line. Elena remained standing by the door, clutching her folder. Alexander Frost looked up. His face was calm, expressionless. Gray eyes behind thin metal frames assessed Elena quickly, professionally. "Have a seat." His voice was level, without inflection. Elena sat in the hard chair across from him. The distance between them was calculated to maintain formal separation, not too close, not too far. Frost returned to the documents. He opened the folder in front of him and began reading aloud. The company name, tax ID number, registered address. Elena listened, nodding. The words sounded correct but abstract, as if they were about someone else. Frost paused on one page and looked up again. "Your company has come to the attention of the Internal Revenue Service." The phrase came out calmly, without accusation. The wording was careful, almost neutral. But inside Elena, something tightened. Not pain, not fear. Emptiness. She nodded again because she was accustomed to agreeing with official tones. Frost didn't wait for a response. He turned the page and continued. He spoke about an audit, about procedures, about timelines. Elena heard the words, but couldn't grasp their weight. Frost confirmed Elena's details. Last name, first name, middle initial. Position. Status as company owner. He spoke slowly, as if giving Elena a chance to correct any mistakes if there were any. Elena confirmed everything. Frost made a note in the documents and looked up. "You're the principal. You're responsible." The phrase sounded like part of an instruction, without emotion. But for Elena, it landed like a blow. The word principal applied to her personally for the first time, not to some abstract role she held formally. Resistance stirred inside her. Elena wanted to say she hadn't made the decisions, that it had all been a formality, that the real principal was Marcus. The words stuck in her throat. The silence stretched. Frost watched Elena calmly, without pressure. Waiting. Elena opened her mouth but said nothing. The familiar excuse, "I didn't know," hung on her tongue, but wouldn't come out. Frost returned to the documents as if Elena's answer no longer mattered. The phrase had taken root, become reality. Elena forced herself to ask questions. About the amounts. About the time period. About what specifically had attracted the IRS's attention. Her voice trembled, but she controlled the intonation, kept it level. Frost answered calmly, referring to regulations and the upcoming audit. Not a single concrete figure. Not a single name. Each reply sounded complete, leaving no room for discussion. Elena began to understand. This vagueness was part of the process. The less she knew, the more vulnerable she became. Frost informed her that further information would be available later, after the documents were reviewed. He closed the folder and placed his hands on the desk. The conversation was over. Elena stood, took her folder, and left. The door closed quietly, but definitively. The corridor greeted her with the same indifferent light and silence. Elena walked quickly, not looking back. She descended the stairs, passed through the lobby, stepped outside. The air was warm, humid. Cars drove past too fast, honking, creating a background noise that irritated her. Elena pulled out her phone and called a cab. She gave the office address. Not home, not to a lawyer. To Marcus. In the car, Elena replayed the conversation with Frost over and over. She tried to find something reassuring in his words, a hook, proof that the situation wasn't as serious as it seemed. She found nothing. The phrase, "you're responsible," echoed in her head, repeating, cutting deeper with each repetition. Elena thought about Marcus. He always knew what to do. That brought temporary relief. The decision to go to Marcus arose not as a choice, but as a reflex. Years of working together had formed a habit. Problem? Go to Marcus. Elena didn't consider other options, didn't think about a lawyer, about checking documents, about finding answers on her own. Marcus was the point toward which she moved automatically, without questioning herself. The office greeted her with familiar noise, muffled conversations, the clatter of keyboards, the hum of air conditioning. Elena walked past the reception desk without stopping. The secretary nodded but asked no questions. The conference room was at the end of the corridor, behind a glass partition. The door was closed, but the light was on. Elena knocked and entered. Marcus sat at the table, looking at his laptop. He raised his head, and his face remained calm, as if he'd been expecting Elena, as if he knew she would come. "Have a seat." His voice was level, without tension. Marcus closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. His posture was straight, his movements relaxed. The contrast with Elena's tension was striking. "Coffee?" Elena shook her head. Marcus poured himself some from the thermos on the table, took a sip. The pause stretched, but Elena didn't speak. Her throat felt tight, words wouldn't form. Marcus set down the cup and looked at Elena attentively. "What did they say?" Elena placed the folder on the table. "An audit. The company came to their attention." Marcus nodded, as if he'd heard something expected. "Standard procedure. We'll get through this." His tone was confident, almost casual. Elena wanted to believe him. His calm lifted some of the weight, gave the impression that the situation was manageable. Marcus didn't ask extra questions about the visit to the IRS, didn't ask what exactly the agent had said, what amounts he'd mentioned, what timelines he'd indicated. As if he already knew. This unsettled Elena, but she didn't articulate the suspicion. Marcus stood, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out a folder. Thick, dark blue, bound with an elastic band. He placed it on the table in front of Elena and sat back down. "I've got a solution ready." Elena looked at the folder without touching it. "What solution?" Marcus opened the folder and began to explain. "These audits are standard practice. The IRS looks for discrepancies, and they can be addressed. Correcting the reporting, clarifying the data." Marcus avoided words like falsification or fraud, using neutral terminology instead. Elena listened, but didn't understand the details. Marcus spoke quickly, confidently, flipping through pages, pointing at lines. "You don't need to worry about the details. I've thought it all through." The phrase sounded caring, almost soothing. Elena felt a familiar relief. Once again, no decisions were required of her, only a signature. The familiar role. Comfortable. But now this relief was accompanied by a faint yet persistent internal resistance. Elena couldn't explain it, but it was there, quiet, stubborn. Marcus pushed the folder closer to Elena. The gesture was slow, confident. Next to the folder, he placed a pen, expensive, black, the one Elena usually used to sign documents, a ritual repeated for years. Elena looked at the folder, at the pen, at Marcus. Unexpectedly, even to herself, she pushed the folder back. The gesture came without words. Elena didn't say no, didn't explain why. She simply pushed it away. A pause emerged between them. Marcus didn't raise his voice, didn't rush her. He watched Elena calmly, expectantly. His calm began to feel like pressure, invisible but palpable. The documents lay between them, transforming into a physical embodiment of conflict. Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms over his chest. "What's bothering you?" His voice was steady, without irritation. Elena didn't answer right away. She stared at the folder, at the closed cover beneath which lay pages requiring her signature. For the first time, she wasn't rushing to perform the expected action. This changed the dynamics of the scene, made it incomplete, tense. Elena opened the folder, slowly, carefully. She began to read the documents properly, line by line, not flipping through, not skimming over familiar phrasing. She read attentively, absorbing every figure, every date. Elena noticed repeating patterns, identical wording, the regularity of transactions that had passed through the company month after month. The papers looked systematic, precise, like part of a long-running mechanism. Elena realized these documents hadn't been created in haste, weren't a reaction to the audit. This was a prepared instrument,
Marcus sat silently watching. Elena's hands trembled slightly, but her gaze became focused, hard. She turned pages, compared dates, searched for discrepancies. Marcus tapped his finger on the table once, quietly, a habit that surfaced when he was waiting for a decision. Elena didn't react. She kept reading. She saw the business not as Marcus's abstract activity, but as a system into which she'd been formally built. Her name repeated on every document: authorization, consent, confirmation. Elena closed the folder. The silence stretched. Marcus watched her, waiting. Elena placed her hands on the folder but didn't push it back toward Marcus. The situation ran deeper than it had seemed this morning. This wasn't a mistake, not an accident. A stable scheme that had existed for years. Elena realized her signatures hadn't been formalities. They had been permission. Something was shifting inside Elena, slow but irreversible. The familiar excuse, "I didn't know," stopped working. She had known. Not specifically, not in detail, but enough to ask questions. Enough to refuse. For years she'd chosen not to know, not to get involved, not to complicate things. The choice had seemed safe. Now it had transformed into responsibility. Elena stood, took her folder. She left Marcus's folder on the table, untouched. "I need to think." Her voice was quiet but firm. Marcus didn't object. He nodded as if understanding. "All right. Think about it. But there isn't much time." Elena left the conference room, walked down the corridor, took the elevator down. She stepped out of the office onto the street. The sun stood high, its light cutting into her eyes. Elena stopped by the building, leaned against the wall. Her breathing was uneven. The illusion of safety was completely shattered. The problem hadn't appeared today. It had existed for years. Elena had simply stopped turning away from it. Elena returned home late, when the streets had already emptied. The elevator rose slowly, humming. She stood against the wall, pressing the folder to her chest. She found the key immediately, but it took her a long time to open the door. Her fingers wouldn't obey. The apartment greeted her with silence. Elena didn't turn on the light in the hallway, went straight to the kitchen. Her coat remained hanging on a chair. Elena hadn't taken it all the way off, had only shrugged it from one shoulder, as if unsure she'd be staying long. She turned on only the lamp above the table. Light fell sharply, cutting a circle from the darkness around it. Elena placed the folder on the table and opened it. Documents lay unevenly, overlapping each other. Order didn't matter. Her name repeated on every page. The signature, neat, recognizable. Elena ran her finger over one of them as if checking whether it was real. The handwriting was confident, without doubt. Elena remembered how she'd signed these, between meetings, in hallways, standing up. Back then, it had seemed like efficiency, professionalism. Now, a trail. Not a single document looked suspicious on its own. Invoices, reports, delivery orders. Everything proper, official, with stamps. That's precisely what created the feeling of a trap. Too normal. Elena turned the pages slowly, comparing dates, amounts, contractor names. The repeating patterns became obvious. Elena noticed. Nowhere beside her signature did Marcus's name appear. Only Elena. Her position, her status, her responsibility. Marcus existed in the company structure abstractly as executive director, but without concrete documentation. This discovery didn't trigger panic. Panic requires surprise. Elena felt instead a sticky, persistent bewilderment. The clock on the wall showed 2 a.m. Elena stood, walked to the bedroom, lay down on top of the blanket. Without undressing, she stared at the ceiling. The apartment's silence felt unnatural, too dense. She could hear the clock ticking, the elevator humming, the distant rumble of traffic. Sounds Elena had never noticed before now became intrusive. Sleep wouldn't come. Elena's thoughts weren't chaotic. On the contrary, they were too orderly. She methodically reviewed situations where she could have intervened, asked, checked, refused. Each time she hit the same wall, Elena hadn't wanted to know. This realization wasn't accompanied by self-blame, but it destroyed the familiar version of herself as accidentally involved. A signature is an action, not a gesture of trust, an action that leaves a trace. Elena repeated this to herself, as if trying to memorize a formula. The law doesn't care about intentions. The law records facts. The agent's phrase, "You're responsible," echoed in her head evenly, without emotion. A statement, not a warning. By 6 a.m, Elena got up, not because she'd rested, but because lying there had become unbearable. She washed her face with cold water, looked at herself in the mirror. Pale face, circles under her eyes. Elena pulled a dark dress and blazer from the closet. She dressed carefully, methodically, as if preparing for an exam. External order as compensation for internal chaos. Elena decided to go to a lawyer. The decision came not as an active choice, but more as an attempt to restore structure. The lawyer would have answers, rules, a clear algorithm. Elena hoped for this, clinging to faith in a system that hadn't yet completely collapsed. She gathered the documents back into the folder, fastened her bag, left. Outside, the city was waking up. People hurried to work, crossed streets, talked on phones. For them, the day was just beginning. For Elena, time had compressed into a single point. Elena called a cab, got in the back seat. The driver didn't talk, which was a relief. Elena looked out the window, watching the morning traffic. Responsibility is strangely constructed. You don't feel it until it becomes a threat. For years, Elena had signed papers, considering it a formality. Marcus explained the schemes quickly, confidently, and Elena agreed because trust seemed simpler than oversight. Now, every signature had turned into evidence, not of guilt, but of participation. Elena checked her phone. No messages from Marcus. This surprised and unsettled her at the same time. Usually, Marcus texted early, morning plans, questions, instructions. The silence created a feeling of emptiness. Elena wrote first. Need to talk. She sent it. No response came. The lawyer's office was located in a quiet alley, in an old building with wooden-framed windows. Elena climbed the stairs, knocked, entered. The lawyer greeted her without a smile, but politely. Have a seat. Elena sat across from him, placed the folder on her lap. She began explaining the situation, trying to speak evenly, without excessive emotion. The lawyer listened without interrupting. He made notes in his pad. When Elena finished, he set down his pen and looked at her carefully. Formally, you're the principal and owner of the company. His voice was dry, professional. That means the responsibility rests with you. The law doesn't distinguish between actual influence and formal status. The words didn't sound cruel. It was precisely their neutrality that made the situation final. Elena nodded as if confirming the obvious. But is there a possibility? The lawyer tilted his head. There is. 1. You need to be the first to voluntarily report the problem. Begin cooperation before the audit becomes official. Elena straightened. What does that mean? The lawyer flipped a page in his notepad. You go to the IRS yourself. Explain the situation. Provide documents. Show willingness to cooperate. This mitigates the consequences. Doesn't eliminate them, but mitigates them. The pauses between his words were measured, like someone repeating instructions. But there's a condition. The lawyer looked up. Time. Once the audit officially begins, or another participant gives testimony first, that window closes. You need to act now. Not tomorrow. Now. The phrase hung in the air. Elena felt time transform from an abstract concept into an active participant in the conflict. How much time do I have? The lawyer shrugged. Unknown. The audit could begin at any moment. Days? Hours? I can't say precisely. Elena gripped the edge of the folder. Her fingers dug into the leather. And if I don't make it in time? The lawyer looked at her evenly. You'll lose the opportunity to mitigate consequences. Only defense within the process will remain. Elena stood, took the folder. Thank you. Her voice was quiet but firm. The lawyer walked her to the door. As a parting word, he added, The main thing, don't delay. Elena nodded and left. Descending the stairs, she felt a strange relief. A plan had emerged, clear, understandable. Honesty as strategy, not sacrifice. Outside, Elena stopped, leaned against the building wall. She pulled out her phone. Marcus still hadn't responded. Elena dialed his number. Long rings. He declined the call. This unsettled her more than the silence. Marcus never declined calls. Elena wrote again. Where are you? I need to talk to you urgently. She sent it. The response came a minute later. At the office. Come over. A brief message without explanation. Elena called a cab, gave the address. During the ride, she formed a plan. Explain her decision to Marcus, propose they act together, go to the IRS with a disclosure. The plan seemed logical, fair. Elena believed there would be consequences, but they would be less severe if they acted correctly. The office greeted her with the familiar hum of air conditioning. Elena walked into the conference room. Marcus sat at the table, looking at his phone. He looked up, smiled. Elena, come in. Coffee? His tone was light, almost warm. Elena shook her head, sat across from him. Marcus set down his phone, leaned back in his chair. You look tired. We need to talk. Elena placed the folder on the table. About the situation. Marcus nodded. I'm aware, already thinking about a solution. His voice was calm, without worry. Elena felt the familiar relief. Marcus was taking the initiative. But the relief was accompanied by resistance, quiet but persistent. I went to see a lawyer. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And? Elena exhaled. He said I have a chance to mitigate the consequences. If I go to the IRS first. Marcus froze. His face remained calm, but the pause stretched. You're serious? Elena nodded. It's the only way out. Marcus stood, walked to the window. He stood silently, looking at the street. Elena, we're a team. We've always solved problems together. His voice was soft, persuasive. These audits are routine. They've happened before, and we've managed. Elena listened, feeling her resolve begin to weaken, not because of the arguments, because of exhaustion. Marcus returned to the table, sat across from Elena. I understand you're scared. That's normal. But panic is a bad advisor. We can solve this without drastic steps, without risk. He spoke slowly, pausing between phrases. Elena caught herself wanting to believe. The familiar script was trying to reassert itself. Marcus, initiative. Elena, agreement. Marcus poured himself water from the carafe, took a sip. By the way, the audit could begin at any moment. The phrase sounded like a technical detail, but Elena flinched. At any moment. The lawyer's words came back. The window of opportunity is closing. Time, an active participant. Elena looked at Marcus carefully. You know about this?
Of course. Marcus shrugged. That's why I'm saying we need to act fast. I have the documents ready. We just need your signature. Elena saw the contradiction clearly for the first time, calming while simultaneously pushing for quick decisions. Marcus stood, walked to the cabinet, pulled out the familiar dark blue folder. He placed it in front of Elena. This is corrected reporting. Everything's been verified. No risks. Marcus pushed the folder closer, placed the pen beside it. The gesture was slow, confident, ritualistic. Elena looked at the folder, at the pen, at Marcus. Inside her, a boundary emerged, clear, impassable. No. Her voice was quiet but firm. Marcus froze. What? I'm not signing this. Elena pushed the folder back. Marcus straightened. His face remained calm, but his gaze turned cold. Elena, do you understand what you're doing? I understand. I'm going to the IRS. I'm going to tell the truth. The pause stretched. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest. You're sure? His voice was level, without emotion. Elena nodded. It's the only thing I can do right now. Marcus looked at her for a long time, appraisingly. All right, your choice. He took the folder from the table, put it back in the cabinet. His movements were slow, controlled. Elena stood, took her folder. I need to go. Marcus walked her to the door. As a parting word, he said, think it over one more time, before it's too late. Elena didn't answer. She left the conference room, walked down the corridor, took the elevator down. After leaving the office, she stopped by the building. Her breathing was uneven. Her hands trembled. Elena pulled out her phone, checked the time. 10:30. Elena called a cab. She gave the address of the IRS building. In the car, she looked out the window, watching the city. Honesty might not save her. Elena understood that. But for the first time, she was choosing an action she was willing to be responsible for herself. Not because Marcus said so, not because it was more convenient, because it was right, or, at least, honest. The car stopped at the familiar building. Elena got out, adjusted the strap of her bag, gripped the folder. She entered the lobby, passed through the metal detector, climbed the stairs. The corridor greeted her with the same indifferent light. Elena took an empty chair, got a ticket, waited. Elena left the apartment at 7 in the morning, not pausing at the threshold. The door closed quietly, almost softly. Elena descended the stairs without waiting for the elevator. Her steps were even, measured. For the first time in several days, Elena wasn't listening to herself, wasn't checking her internal state. The decision had been made, and that freed her from endless weighing. Outside, the air was cold, clear. Elena inhaled deeply, felt her lungs fill. The sensation felt right. Elena didn't check her phone, didn't look to see if Marcus had written. This gesture, the absence of checking, felt important, a symbol of separation. Elena called a cab, gave the address, got in the back seat. The driver was silent, which was a relief. Elena looked out the window, watching the city. Morning traffic, people with coffee, hurrying to work. An ordinary day for them. For Elena, a point she'd been walking toward for several days. Elena repeated the structure of the conversation to herself. The phrasing was clear, precise. Formal role, trust, lack of intent. The words were calming. Elena convinced herself that honesty wasn't an impulse, but a strategy, a rational decision. There was logic in this belief, and logic created a sense of security. Elena didn't notice that her confidence was based on an assumption. The system was waiting for precisely this version. Elena believed in a fair procedure, in an order that took circumstances into account. The drive seemed shorter than usual. The car stopped at the familiar building. Elena paid, got out. She adjusted the strap of her bag, gripped the folder, entered the lobby. The guard at the metal detector nodded without looking up. Elena passed without delay. Everything was familiar down to the smallest details: the smell, the light, the layout of the corridors. The repetition reduced anxiety. Elena perceived this place as already familiar territory, not a source of threat, but a point on the map where processes occurred. Elena climbed the stairs. The corridor greeted her with the same indifferent light: beige walls, flickering lamps. Elena took an empty chair, pulled a folded sheet of notes from her bag. Elena didn't read them. The mere fact of having a plan was stabilizing. Elena mentally rehearsed the opening of her speech, calmly, without emotion. Facts, sequence, conclusions. Muffled voices and footsteps echoed in the corridor. Elena felt separated from them by an invisible wall, focused on the upcoming conversation. Elena was certain. Clarity and coherence mattered. The board clicked. Elena's number lit up. She stood, took the folder, walked down the corridor to the familiar door, knocked. Entered without delay, without trying to postpone the moment. This time, Elena was ready. The office looked unchanged: desk, folders, computer, clock on the wall. This created a sense of stability, predictability. Alexander Frost sat at the desk, looking at documents. He looked up. "Come in." His voice was level, without inflection. Elena sat in the chair across from him, placed the folder on her lap. Frost closed one folder, opened another. His movements were slow, methodical. Elena perceived this as a sign of impartiality. Calm. Elena didn't notice. Impartiality here meant an absence of expectations. Frost pulled out a voice recorder, placed it on the table between them. "This conversation will be recorded. Do you consent?" Elena nodded. "Yes." Frost pressed the button. The click was distinct, final. At that moment, the conversation ceased being a conversation. It became a record. Elena felt brief tension in her shoulders, but quickly composed herself. Elena perceived the recorder as confirmation of the seriousness of her own step. Truth, officially recorded, carries weight. Frost folded his hands on the table. "I'm listening." Elena exhaled, began to speak. Evenly, sequentially, as she'd prepared. Elena explained how the company had been registered in her name, how Marcus had made the decisions, how Elena hadn't gotten involved in the financial details. Elena avoided emotional phrasing. She relied on facts, emphasized the absence of personal gain and initiative. The speech sounded convincing, within Elena's logic. Elena felt she was speaking correctly. This strengthened her confidence. Frost listened without interrupting, made notes in his pad, showed no reaction. His face was calm, focused. The absence of feedback began to trouble Elena. She searched the agent's face for signs of understanding. Found none. Frost wrote without looking up. Elena continued speaking, but the words seemed to disappear into a void. They met no resistance, but received no confirmation either. At that moment, Elena felt for the first time, words don't control the process. They simply add to the data set. Elena finished, paused, waited. Frost finished writing a line, set down his pen, looked up. "Are you finished?" "Yes." Frost turned the page. "Your partner has already given testimony." The phrase came out neutrally, without emphasis. Technical. For Elena,
This phrase sounded like a sharp shift of ground beneath her feet.
Elena froze.
When? Frost looked at the documents. 3 days ago. Voluntarily came forward as part of pre-litigation settlement. 3 days. Elena instantly recalled the lawyer's words about time as the decisive factor. The window of opportunity. Being first. The logic of being first collapsed instantly. Elena had come at the wrong time. She was late.
What did he say?
Elena's voice was quiet but steady. Frost opened another folder, pulled out several sheets, handed them to Elena. You can review them. Elena took the papers. Her hands didn't tremble, but her fingers gripped tighter than necessary. She began to read, line by line. The words formed a version Elena didn't recognize.
In Marcus's testimony, Elena was the initiator of decisions, the controlling party. He described Elena as the person who made financial decisions. Marcus presented himself as an executor acting on Elena's instructions. Every formulation was precise, neutral, without accusations, but with clear structure. Elena read to the end, looked up at Frost. This isn't true.
Frost nodded. Your version has been recorded. He pulled out another folder, opened it, showed Elena the documents. Can you confirm these signatures? Elena looked. She recognized her own signature on every page, neat, confident, without hesitation. The signature Elena had been placing for years without reading. These are my signatures. Frost made a note. According to these documents, you approved the company's financial reporting, made decisions about fund allocation, controlled operations. Elena looked at the papers. Each signature was transforming from a symbol of trust into evidence. Marcus had used precisely what Elena had considered neutral, formal status and the habit of not getting involved.
I signed, but I didn't make the decisions.
Frost looked at Elena evenly. The law records actions, not intentions. Your signature confirms responsibility. The phrase sounded like a verdict, not cruel, but final. Elena understood. Honesty hadn't protected her because it had come too late. All of Elena's arguments became secondary to the facts already on record. Frost closed the folder. Testimony from both parties will be reviewed as part of the investigation. The procedure continues. His voice was calm, procedural. Elena sat motionless. The office felt cramped, though the space hadn't changed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, insistently. Elena realized the situation had entered a phase where choices no longer mitigated consequences. Elena stood, took the folder. Frost followed her with his gaze. You'll be contacted for further procedures. Elena nodded without saying a word, left the office. The corridor greeted her with the same indifferent light. Elena walked slowly, as if underwater. She descended the stairs, passed through the lobby, stepped outside. The sun stood high. The light cut into her eyes. Elena stopped by the building, leaned against the wall, pulled out her phone. The screen was empty. No messages. Elena dialed Marcus's number. Long rings. He declined. Elena lowered the phone, stood there, watching the street where people walked past without noticing. The game had been played without Elena. Marcus had come first. Had used the time while Elena hesitated. Had used the documents Elena had been signing for years. Had used the formal status Elena had considered safe. Everything that had seemed neutral had turned into evidence. Elena was no longer moving forward. Elena was catching up. And falling behind. The tension didn't release through screaming or threats. It crystallized into clear, cold understanding. Elena had chosen honesty, but she'd chosen it too late. The system hadn't been waiting for truth. The system recorded facts. And the facts worked against Elena. Not because Elena was guilty, because Elena was late. Elena pushed off from the wall, walked along the street, not knowing where she was going. Her steps were slow, uncertain. The city hummed around her, indifferent, occupied with its own business. Elena walked, gripping the folder. The only thing that remained, documents with her own signature. Evidence not of guilt, but of participation. Evidence of a choice Elena had been making for years without recognizing the consequences. The phone vibrated. Elena pulled it out. A message from an unknown number. Investigation proceeding. Await summons. Official. Cold. Elena put the phone back, kept walking. Not home, not to the office, just forward. Because there was nowhere to return to. The world in which Elena had been just a signature had ended. Another had begun. Elena entered the IRS building again 3 days after receiving the summons. She walked slowly, without hurry. Everything looked familiar. The guard, the detector, the corridor. But now this wasn't a space for conversation, a place for documentation. Elena climbed the stairs, walked to Alexander Frost's office, knocked, entered. Frost sat at the desk, arranging documents. He looked up. "Have a seat." His voice was level, procedural. Elena sat in the chair across from him, set her bag on the floor. Frost folded his hands on the table. "Your procedural status has changed. You're being processed in this case as a party subject to liability." The phrase came without pause, without softening. Elena heard her own name in the official construction. The weight of the words had shifted. Elena was no longer someone who came to clarify. Elena was inside the case. This didn't trigger panic. The illusions had ended earlier. Now, Elena simply acknowledged there was no exit from the procedure. The process was in motion. Elena was an element of this process. Frost turned the page, began reading the grounds and stages. The wording was precise, stripped of emotion. Elena noticed how the language severed the personal. Instead of "you thought," it has been established. Instead of "you believed," it has been recorded. The language didn't ask questions. It constructed reality. Frost wasn't asking if Elena agreed. He was informing. Elena understood. What mattered wasn't motives, but the sequence of actions. The procedure moved forward on its own, requiring no consent. At that moment, Elena finally stopped waiting for dialogue. What was happening didn't allow for discussion, only movement forward along a predetermined trajectory. Elena was no longer a participant in conversation. Elena was a subject of the record. "Where's Marcus?" Elena's voice was quiet but steady. Frost looked at the documents. "Mr. Levin gave testimony earlier and is being processed in the case under a different status." A pause. Elena nodded. A different status. Myself had exited the game before Elena decided to act. He'd been faster. Not smarter, not more honest. Faster. This confirmed an understanding that had come days earlier. In this system, speed was a form of power. Marcus had always operated from this principle. Elena had hesitated, weighed options, doubted. Marcus had moved. While Elena was choosing honesty, Marcus was choosing priority. And the system had recorded his version. Frost opened the folder, began arranging documents on the table. Papers lay evenly, in logical order. Elena saw reports, contracts, appendices. Each page confirmed the next. Elena recognized her own signature, not one, but dozens. Elena's signature became the connecting element. Without it, the system wouldn't work. Elena understood. Evidence functioned as a construction. It was impossible to remove one element because each supported the others. For the first time, Elena saw how separate, insignificant actions formed a whole that no longer needed explanation. The documents spoke for themselves. Elena's signature, consent. Consent, responsibility. The system hadn't made a moral choice. The system had chosen the path of least resistance. Marcus's version was confirmed by documents, Elena's version by words. For the procedure, these weren't equal values. Elena understood. Even if she'd spoken earlier, it wouldn't have guaranteed salvation. But it would have given her a chance. Now, there was no chance. This wasn't injustice. It was the logic of the mechanism. The system didn't seek revenge and didn't protect. The system continued moving. Elena had entered this movement too late. Lateness had become destiny. Not because Elena was more guilty than Marcus, because time had worked against Elena. Frost turned the page, looked at Elena. The law doesn't distinguish between passivity and intent when a signature is placed voluntarily. His voice was calm, professional. The phrase sounded like a conclusion. Elena heard it as the formula for her entire journey. Trust, exhaustion, the desire to not interfere. None of it mattered in legal logic. Elena understood. She'd tried to defend herself with moral arguments in a system where only formal ones worked. This gap had become fatal. The realization didn't trigger an emotional outburst. It was recorded as a final conclusion. Elena no longer searched for a way to explain herself. Explanations didn't change facts. Facts had been recorded. Inside Elena, a final shift was occurring. Elena stopped perceiving what was happening as the result of a bad day or someone else's betrayal. Elena saw clearly. The real mistake had been made many years ago when Elena agreed to be just a signature. The decision had repeated again and again, becoming a habit. The habit had led to this current point. This realization didn't destroy Elena. It organized the picture. Responsibility ceased being an external threat. It became a logical consequence. Elena understood. For years, she'd chosen convenience over clarity. For years, she hadn't asked questions. For years, she'd placed her signature without reading. Each time it had seemed trivial. Now the trivial details formed a structure. Elena stopped trying to appear reasonable or innocent, stopped explaining circumstances and context. Silence wasn't surrender. It was rejection of her former role. Before, Elena had sought justification for non-participation. Now, Elena was abandoning that. For the first time, Elena wasn't defending the image of herself as a convenient, careful person who simply didn't know, a gesture almost invisible from the outside. But it was precisely this that marked a personal breaking point. Elena stopped being the nominal director. She became a person who answers for her own actions, not because the system forced her, because Elena acknowledged it internally. Without hope for relief, without expectation of forgiveness. Frost looked at Elena expectantly. "Do you have anything to add to your testimony?" Elena exhaled, began to speak. Her voice was even, calm. Elena talked about why the business had been registered in her name, why it had been convenient for Marcus, why Elena had allowed it to continue. Elena didn't search for mitigating phrases. Elena wasn't counting on a result. The words were spoken not for defense, but for precision. Elena was speaking truth for the first time without expecting benefit. That's precisely why the truth sounded different, as documentation, not as a plea. Frost listened, making notes. His face was calm, focused. Elena understood. What was said would be taken into account, but wouldn't change the course of the case. This didn't devalue Elena's action. It simply placed it in the proper context. Elena accepted this without internal resistance. For the first time, Elena didn't need external validation to consider an action meaningful. Elena wasn't speaking for Frost or for the case. Elena was speaking for herself. To record understanding. To call things by their names. Frost asked clarifying questions. Elena answered, briefly, without extra words. Frost wrote. The procedure continued. The clock ticked in the office. Light fell from above, illuminating the documents on the table. Elena looked at the papers and understood. These were no longer just papers. This was materialized history. A history of choices Elena had been making for years. While Frost prepared the protocol, Elena mentally connected the elements. The business registration as protection for Marcus, Marcus's confidence in his own speed, the decisive role of time. Everything formed a pattern. Elena understood. What was happening wasn't random or unique. A standard story in which Elena had long played a convenient role. This knowledge didn't console, but it stabilized. Elena no longer felt deceived. Elena felt included in reality, completely. Without illusions, without justifications. Reality had turned out harsher than Elena had imagined, but now Elena saw it clearly. And this clarity was worth more than comfort. Frost closed the folder, handed Elena a form to sign. Confirmed the testimony was given voluntarily. Elena took the pen, signed. The movement was familiar, but now the signature didn't mean agreement with someone else's decision. It meant acknowledgement of her own. Elena returned the form. Frost filed it in the folder. You'll be contacted for further procedural actions. His voice was even, concluding. Elena nodded. She stood, took her bag. Frost followed her with his gaze. Elena left the office. The door closed quietly. The corridor greeted her with the same indifferent light. Elena stopped by the window, looked out at the street. The tension hadn't disappeared. It had stopped growing. It had crystallized, like pressure she'd have to get used to. Elena understood. Consequences lay ahead. But there was no more chaos inside. Elena no longer tried to guess what would happen. Didn't construct versions where everything would turn out differently. Elena simply knew. Responsibility had stopped being someone else's. This knowledge brought no relief, gave no hope for justice. It simply existed, stable, clear, final. Elena descended the stairs, stepped outside. The sun beat down on her face. The city hummed, indifferent to private dramas. Elena walked along the street, not knowing exactly where, but for the first time, without the feeling she was moving in the wrong direction. The formula assembled itself, without grandeur or consolation. Responsibility doesn't arrive suddenly. It simply stops being someone else's one day. Elena stops at the crosswalk, waits for the green light. People pass by, hurrying with their business. Elena no longer stood out among them with internal chaos. She looked just as calm, but inside, different. Elena, who no longer hid behind formality, didn't wait for someone to make decisions for her. Didn't believe that non-participation freed her from consequences. Elena, who was fully present in her own life for the first time, even if that life currently looked like a procedure, even if uncertainty lay ahead. Elena no longer ran from reality. The light switched to green. Elena crossed the street. Her steps were even, confident. The story hadn't ended with salvation. It had ended with a point of clarity. A point where Elena stopped being just a signature and became a person who answers for her choices. Not because the system decided it, because Elena decided it.